Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and as always, I'm joined by Lisa. How's it going?
It's going really well. I'm out of town visiting a friend, and it's been really nice to get to see somebody. I haven't seen her in a while, and she's moved out of town because her mom is having had health things and has had to move into a memory care facility, and so there's been a lot of grief talk, but it's just like a reminder of people having to relocate. Like, she's had to relocate to be near this memory care facility where her mom is, and just doesn't have anyone around. Like, she's trying to meet friends, and she and her husband both work from home, so they don't have jobs where they're like meeting people at work. Like, there's just none of that built in stuff. They don't have kids, so it's not like they're meeting the parents of other kids at school or anything like that. And yeah, it's just been a reminder for me of how hard it is to relocate in general, but especially to relocate when you're dealing with something devastating. And then you're also dealing with something devastating all alone, thinking I should be trying to meet people or trying to get established of what's around in this community. I don't know. It's just tough. So that's on my mind this morning, as I'm crammed into a corner of her house trying to podcast.
Yeah, I can absolutely see that. When you start off on a new chapter, I think you always think like, oh, things are going to fall into place, or they'll come, or I'll find people. And sometimes you really do have to brush off those like skills of meeting people and finding places and putting yourself out there. And that can be hard when you're going through something that's really challenging, like parent or any family member's health issues. So I could see that. Yeah.
How are you?
I'm good. Interestingly, I've been thinking about grief from kind of like another angle. Like, you're talking about a friend whose parent is ill, and that of course is something that is one of those sort of non-death losses, right, that we go through. And I've been thinking about grief from sort of another angle, in that I've been thinking about how grief is just kind of like everywhere. It's inherent in just like everything in a way, because we're getting kind of into the spring, which means that even though we're far away from like summertime, there's a lot of activity going on in my world around the kids and school and things like that. Because I have one who's wrapping up preschool and will be going into kindergarten. I have one who's wrapping up middle school and who'll be going to high school. And then I have one who we're just starting the college thing for, looking at colleges and things. And I just, all these things are like they're positive things, like, right? Like, they're the things that you want to happen for your kids. Like, that's like the goal, is for them to be able to have these exciting new experiences and to grow up and to be able to move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. But at the same time, it's just really, there's a lot of it that's really kind of sad, and that has me being like, oh, and so it just really reminds me that grief is really just, it's inherent in life. Even if like things are going the way they're supposed to, you're going to run into these little losses, and that even with like really positive experiences, there's often grief a part of it. And I think that's something that we don't always acknowledge, because you don't want to be a buzzkill, or people are like, oh, just like, this is positive. How could you bring everything down? How could you be thinking about the sad parts of it? But like, I think because I work in this world that I work in, and because I've experienced loss, I feel like I'm just attuned to it. Like, my attentional bias kind of skews towards the griefy stuff and not necessarily towards like the more positive stuff. And so I'm just really kind of aware of it and how it creeps up and can be a little confusing, I think, for people at times. And honestly, for me personally, because I know that these experiences are such a mix. And because I know that I personally am just tuned in to that side of things, I think it's like frustrating me a little bit that I don't naturally go to the more positive side of it, like to seeing it as these good things and to seeing all the good stuff about it. Of course I see those things, but the stuff that really is hitting me deep down is the sad bits. And so I'm like, oh, I don't know, maybe I need to be more active about like being in the present and focusing on like all the whole range of experience. But I don't always do that. It's usually just easier to go with whatever flow is pulling you in whatever direction, right? So
Yeah, I think it's so true though, but it is that like, that attentional bias is real. Like I think that it's hard, like once your mind starts to go to that place of thinking about all the things that are going to be hard and the losses and the sad part, it's hard to then sort of unsee it and refocus yourself. Like I think it takes a really deliberate effort of saying, okay, wow, I've really started to see everything through this grief lens. Now I need to actually do something active to try to shift to the other pieces. And I think it's hard to have the motivation to do that, especially when there's so much else that's going on. I just was talking, I did a workshop last week for some folks that was on substance related deaths and just stigmatized losses in general. And something that came up in there too was the same sort of idea. I like wrote up on the board that Ken Doka, this well-known grief researcher and clinician, he's written many books and done a lot of research. He has this little equation that he sometimes puts up: change equals loss equals grief. And he talks about how that change is any change, because one of the things we were talking about in that group was folks were talking about just the positive change that comes with substance abuse recovery. And when people, not in cases where people die of a substance related death, but where people survive and find long-term treatment, and talking about all of the loss that comes with that as well. And how, sort of like you're saying, it's one of those spaces that you feel like we're just supposed to be looking at all the positive stuff. This is the exciting thing. This is the great thing. This is what everybody was hoping for. And yet there are still these losses that come with it. And I think one of the things they were saying there, which I imagine may be a little bit true for you as well, is that when you work in this space, on the one hand, you're more attuned to the fact that grief is everywhere. When you've been through loss, you're more attuned to it. But also, I think you're a little more subject to like comparing, like there are people out there who we work with all the time whose children have died. And so like to be talking about the sadness, or there's people who we're working with whose family members have died of overdoses. So how can we be making space for the loss that comes with finding substance abuse recovery? Like it feels sometimes hard to be able to say like, it's all true. Like of course, the grief in these positive changes is nothing in scope compared to the devastating grief of these, tremendous losses that can come from a death. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't acknowledge it and make space for it and talk about it.
I mean, I think that it's interesting. Our community from our hub is joining us here in the comments, and there's a lot of really good stuff that they're sharing right now. And one is that grief and loss and life, they're just all intertwined in it in a way that I feel that they build upon each other. And so I think for me, a lot of times it's that knowledge of how vulnerable and precious life is. It's the fact that I lost my mother, before I was ready. And before she was ready. It's the knowledge that I'm not going to be here forever for my kids. It's the knowledge that anything could happen at any moment that puts me squarely in the middle of that paradox where I'm like, oh my gosh, like every moment is so precious and fleeting and also so like valuable. And so I think it's the fact that I have experienced loss and am aware of loss that makes me then more somebody, Holly said in our chat here that she's more grief aware. And I think it just makes me more grief and loss aware. And Dave also mentions that the person that he wants to share the good things with is gone. And I think that's another piece of it as well. It's so layered. It's like, it's also that fact that people who I would want to celebrate these milestones with are not here. And that makes me sad. And that pulls me back into the past a lot. And I think, this is just my experience of it. Other people may relate to that or not. But yeah, I just think it's also intertwined. And so I think it is important to acknowledge that, and to acknowledge that it's everywhere. Life is bittersweet, as many people say. And I think that kind of lends itself a little bit to what we wanted to talk about, because we wanted to talk a little bit about just kind of like one of those philosophical things about our approach to grief and loss that really does acknowledge how nuanced and individual and also interwoven grief and loss experiences are. And so I think in a way, it's not a perfect transition, but I do think they're not entirely unrelated.
Yeah, it was funny. We went back, and a while back on the podcast, we put a survey out for listeners and said, if you have any feedback and suggestions and topics and things like that, please write in. And many of you did. Thank you. And we did look at them and read them. And we've been trying to use some of those ideas as we come up with new topics. And one of the questions, or one of the things that someone said was, she said, I love your podcast. And it's funny because part of what I think drew her to the podcast maybe was the name, What's Your Grief? And she was like, it's funny because your podcast is called What's Your Grief, but you don't talk about what people's specific grief is. And as I read it, I was like, what does she mean? And then she went on to sort of say, like, you don't talk about the grief of losing a spouse, the grief of losing a child, the grief of, I think like that maybe she imagined the episodes would be broken out by your grief is the type of relationship you lost. That's what defined it. And, it's interesting because I think we, in many ways, that isn't how we really conceptualize grief and exactly what people's grief is per se. And I do think, as I've been reflecting on this, a lot of the resources that are out there are divided up in this way, where it's, here's where you go for loss of a child. Here's where you go for loss of a spouse. Here's where you go for loss of a parent. Here's where you go for loss of a sibling. And it sort of breaks it down in that way. And that's never been something on the What's Your Grief website. We've never had it broken down that way. When we offer workshops, webinars, groups, it's just never been the way we approach it and breaking it down. And yet we've never really talked about why that is. So it felt like, since somebody wrote in with a question about it, that it would make sense to spend a little time talking about why that's not the way we think about it.
Yeah, I think it might be useful to start by acknowledging why we think people do want things categorized in that sort of way, and validating that there is very real benefit in some ways to having that. I think a lot of times people are initially looking for support that really closely matches their experience. And that's understandable when you've experienced something so overwhelming and something so kind of foreign. I think it makes sense that you would want to simplify matters by going to the things that are most likely going to be relevant to you. So I definitely think that makes sense. And then we always say, like, of course, losses that are similar in nature are going to have commonalities that are really useful to be able to learn from one another and to be able to relate to someone. It helps you to know that you're not the only one, you're not alone. So I absolutely see the space for that. I also think, especially when a loss is more stigmatized, people tend to feel like they're the only one, like they're alone. And then when they meet people who are like, me too, I've had this happen as well, it can be a humongous relief to know that they're not alone in that, and to have somebody who can kind of share that experience with them. So I do absolutely see the benefits, but we usually say benefits with grain of salt, right?
Yeah, I think that with that, we do see the benefits. And I think on the surface, and we look at easy ways to organize loss and seek connection, thinking about that relationship I see why it is intuitive, and, as you said, why it's beneficial. But I think part of the reason that we have not organized things in that way is when you go even just a little bit deeper, one of the things that I have thought about many times is, if somebody tells me their brother died, that tells me as much and as little as it would tell me if somebody said, oh yeah, hey, I have a brother. Like, we don't know anything about, like, what's the nature of your relationship? Are you close? Are you not close? Are you, is it a fraught relationship? Are there issues there? Are there dynamics that we should know about? Are you, like, all of the questions that come up? Who was your brother? How, like, what's the age difference? All of these things. It tells us really, like, very little about people when we just know that they had a person in their life, that they had a mother, that they had a child, that they had a partner. And so often with grief, what we find is people are navigating these really unique, difficult emotions, some of which are incredibly present in some people's grief and are not a part of other people's grief at all. So, maybe it's anger, maybe it's guilt, maybe it's isolation. Maybe it is that there was an abusive, relationship, or a really a problematic relationship. And that is now bringing up all sorts of things about trying to reconcile the idea that that relationship is never going to be repaired in life, with that person here. Like, there's so many different layers. And oftentimes those are the things, when I think about working with somebody individually, and, if it's in a therapy session around grief, or just having worked with people over the years, once we get past what the relationship was, which is of course the place that we start, very little of the time is spent around the relationship. It's spent around all of these other things that are part of the learning to live alone, learning, figuring out what roles that person occupied in your life, and then how those roles are being filled or not filled now, and who filled those roles before and how is so different for different people. So many times the person who someone was living with in their home is a spouse, right? And from working with so many people grieving, we see so many situations where also it was an adult child and an adult parent who had been living together for many years, or it was a situation where it was, siblings or roommates, friendship relationships that were so incredibly close that they were more like a spouse relationship or like a sibling relationship. And I think over the years of working with that and working with so many people, it's just shifted the way that I think about relationships, and I think about grief, and how it makes sense to sort of bring people together. So I don't know, that's sort of rambling to describe it, but I think that I'm just sort of thinking out loud about what part of my own experience has been, and thinking of it.
I mean, I think that's like the number one reason is because you just can't judge the nature of a relationship by a title. And so a lot of times it might lead you to assume that the relationship was more than it is. It might lead you to assume that the relationship was more distant than it is. Like, you just don't know. And we do often see people end up having their grief kind of minimized and disenfranchised because people hear the title and the relationship type, and they think about their own experiences with that type of relationship, and they make assumptions based on that. So a lot of people will experience the death of a friend who was their dearest friend for their entire life. And that's a really big deal, but people will kind of minimize that and disenfranchise that. And there's not a lot of support necessarily available for that. We've seen a lot of people who maybe were engaged to be married, or they were in a long-term partnership with somebody, who feel as though they can't attend groups for the death of a spouse, or they can't receive that type of support because the title was different, even though the relationship was very much the same in many ways. And so we see a lot of times when we go based on these labels that people are just really, they end up very much misunderstood. And so I think that's the number one reason. And the number two reason for me is just that everyone's experience is different within that relationship, right? Not just about the nature of the relationship, but the way that the relationship functioned. Like, what were the things that you shared? What were the things that made them a part of your life that now are the most difficult to navigate? What are the pieces that are missing now that they're gone? What are the roles that they filled? What is it that they filled for you emotionally? And so there's all those different things that were really unique and specific to that person that might not be unique and specific to another person's relationship, because
Mhm.
we're all so different. Like, we have some commonalities, but we are all so incredibly different. So I feel like it actually makes more sense to connect people based on experiences within their grief. Like, single parenting now might be something that a lot of spouses share, but also maybe grandparents who are now taking care of kids. Things like that. Like, there are experiences that we all share, but they're not necessarily dictated by the type of relationship that we had.
Yeah, I think that this is, yeah, it's just so common how we see it unfold in the relationships being all different types of relationships. And I think that sometimes, and this is maybe one of the other reasons that from very early on, I have always been both cautious and supportive of people seeking out groups that are based on just the relationship of the person who died, is that very early on in working in this field, I had a number of families who I worked with who had a child die and went to bereaved parent groups. And for various reasons, went there thinking like, this is going to be my tribe. These are going to be my people. Like, I feel so alone and devastated. And then getting there and having almost the exact opposite experience of feeling like, wow, these parents' experiences are so different than mine. I ended up feeling like an outsider and a little bit, and in a number of these cases, it was stigmatized losses. So I think that contributed to it, and feeling like an outsider, and then feeling like, well, if I can't get support here among the people who are supposed to be my people, then what does that mean about my grief?
Mhm.
Like, feeling like then I must be a lost cause. There must be nowhere for me. I don't fit anywhere. And we did a lot of work on making sure that they were able to find the groups that ended up being a big support to them. And it worked out really well. It did take thinking a little bit differently about the idea of what were the challenges, where were they going to find connections. But I think that's one of the things that has always stayed with me, is remembering that one of the risks is that if you go and you seek out, say, a spousal loss support group or a sibling loss or parent loss, and you get there and you think, these are the people I'm supposed to connect with, and then you don't, then it can feel ironically even more isolating, because you feel like this was supposed to be the type of connection that people have in their grief. So I think, I
Yeah.
say that because I want people to know that if you have sought out support and connection in this way, and for whatever reason it wasn't a fit, you didn't connect in that very first space that you went to with the other people who were there who also had lost people of the same relationship, that doesn't mean like you're not going to find connections somewhere. It just means that sometimes we have to look for connections in different ways and in different places.
Yeah, exactly. That's where that grain of salt kind of comes in, because we don't want to like undermine or discourage anybody from wanting to connect with people who've had similar experiences to them. We just always want people to look at that experience with kind of a grain of salt, like understanding that maybe the advice they give you isn't going to be great for you. Maybe their experiences aren't going to be exactly what your experiences are. We always say to people, take what works and don't get too hung up on the stuff that doesn't really work for you or doesn't apply to you, because everybody is so incredibly different and everybody is so unique in their grief and loss.
And the shared and the way that we listen, I think this is something that I've also thought a lot about over the years, is that there's this amazing benefit when we have shared experience. Like, there is something that feels so nice about thinking like, oh, here's somebody who really relates to what I've gone through. And also that assumption that starts to happen when we're in a shared space with people who we assume have been through exactly what we've gone through, it sometimes makes it harder for people to
Mhm.
really connect with the other person's experience and not do a little bit of kind
Yeah.
of what you mentioned a minute ago, which is almost assuming that our experience is closer than it actually is, just because we both had the same loss. And I
Yeah.
catch myself, I think now at this point in my work, I think we've both gotten really good at this, but I think early on, especially, I would assume if I met somebody else who had lost somebody to a substance related death, or who had lost a parent when they were a teenager, or, whatever, that we were going to have more in common than we do, or that I was going to see there were going to be connections in these different ways. And, you learn quickly that sometimes that's true,
Yeah.
and sometimes it's not true at all. And so you need to be so careful to keep that openness, to really be listening to someone else and not projecting your own experiences and losses onto them and assuming a shared experience that isn't really there.
Yeah, and when we talk about assumptions, I think there's an inverse assumption that we also want to caution people on, and that's assuming that others who haven't had a similar experience to you or a similar type of loss cannot be supportive and cannot relate to you in any way, because so much about grief is more universal than we think, or more kind of common in different types of losses. And so there are a lot of grief experiences that we write about. And I think this is one of the reasons we have avoided categorical stuff on our site, is because there are so many different experiences that we can talk about that really can't get categorized under one or the other. They're just more general kind of grief experiences. And sometimes the way it's written about, or the way we talk about it, or if it's a different grief site, we have to think about, okay, what is this person saying and how does it apply to our life? Like we said, like, take what works and leave what doesn't. So sometimes we have to do a little work there, but so much really does feel like a common thread amongst different types of losses. And also, I do think there's something to be said for the fact that a good friend or a therapist, they don't have to have experienced the exact same thing you've experienced to be able to be a good friend and therapist, to be able to be an effective support person for you. So I think when we really feel like hyper focused on finding people with the same experiences, we tend to rule out people who don't have the same experiences. And then we're kind of like ruling out people with a lot of wisdom and compassion to offer us that we could benefit from.
Yeah, I think it's true. And I think oftentimes we're so worried. We've talked about this before. We're so worried about being hurt and disappointed and let down. Like, we sometimes hyper focus into, I want to find this magical unicorn that has the exact same experience that I have, to somehow ensure that I won't be disappointed or feel more isolated or have somebody not relate to me again. And so what we do, unfortunately, is then we set ourselves up for it to be almost impossible to find that person. We get messages like this sometimes from folks who are like, I'm trying to find somebody, and then they have this list of like their very unique, specific grief, like that is so specific that you think, oh, if you're trying to find this exact person to connect with, and you think that's the only person who's ever going to be able to bring a feeling of connection with you, you're going to be searching a long time, I think. And I think then what ends up happening is we feel more isolated for longer, because we just think, oh, I'm the only one. And I've ruled out the possibility that a person who didn't have the exact same experience, but had a similar experience, or is going through this other aspect of, guilt that I am, or they're dealing with the same sort of, resentment or isolation, or like you said, parenting, or just trying to live alone, or whatever it is, like finding those kernels of connection and looking there, rather than looking at the differences all the time and saying, well, if it's not this exact list, it's not going to be meaningful or helpful for me.
Yeah, in a way it's delaying our ability to get that support. And it could be that we're intentionally delaying it because we don't feel ready to receive it, or it could be that we're just unintentionally, but in a way, by looking past other opportunities to receive support, we're kind of denying ourselves that opportunity. It may not feel perfect, but when you find the person who has the exact on paper experience, that might not feel perfect either. So we really need to be kind of thinking about, like, what can we benefit from just our experiences and our opportunities for receiving support along the way. Where we talk all the time when we talk about coping, it's a little bit different, but it's similar, about how it's not just one big coping tool that's going to make the difference. Usually it's a lot of little coping tools. And I think with getting support, that can be the same thing. Like sometimes we want to find that exact person who's going to make us feel better, but really it's oftentimes like our own internal work, and then a lot of little support pieces in our support network that fill different needs. We talk a lot about thinking about our support system in terms of like, what are their strengths? Like, don't disregard them just because they're not really good with the emotional stuff. Maybe they're really good at getting you out and going for a walk and getting some air, or maybe they're really helpful in some other way. So thinking about maybe piecing together that support network as opposed to looking for that one thing.
And you saying that makes me think about how in so many ways we founded What's Your Grief to fill gaps that we saw in the grief support that existed at the time. And I think we had the luxury in a lot of ways of knowing that the space of grief support by relationship, like that was already filled. Like we knew if you're somebody who was really looking for, okay, I absolutely want to go and find support by this type of relationship, you were going to be able to find that. And, one of the things I think we really wanted to do was to create spaces that offered a little bit of an alternative to just the way that grief support had been being offered and being conceptualized and categorized for these different reasons. And I think with that, it was our hope that people would be able to come to What's Your Grief and get one type of support, but still be able to go to their hospice and get the type of support that they were offering there. And, other places that you could sort of pick and choose and put things together. Like it doesn't have to be this either or. Either you go to a spouse loss support group or you get your grief support in a way that doesn't categorize in that way. No, it can be both. Like it can be both. I think it's just allowing that openness for the different types of ways of thinking about it and conceptualizing it and approaching it. And I haven't talked about that explicitly.
Yeah. And the way we're talking about it probably sounds exhausting to some people. Like, oh, now I got to go like find a cast of characters to fill out my support network. It doesn't need to be that. Like, I think even just opening yourself up to the possibility of support can be one step in that direction. Cause it's like, you just kind of over time, hopefully come into contact and collect a network of people. It's not like this big production necessarily, It's not like you're going to go like fill up your coping toolbox like tomorrow. It's like you slowly discover the things that help. And I know that also sounds exhausting because it's like this long kind of haul, but it's something that hopefully can happen with a mix of kind of more organic experiences. And also there does sometimes need to be some intentionality and some kind of us actively taking those steps. So I guess long story short, I think we're kind of saying there's a place for it all here. There's definitely benefit in looking for people who share certain experiences, but just knowing that they might not share every experience or they may not really fill that space necessarily, and having kind of an open mind about the other types of support that doesn't immediately kind of fit what you would have been looking for if that was how you went out and started looking for grief support.
And I think one other thing I'll add that I think is good if you're seeking support or also providing support is just to remember that when somebody shares the type of the loss, who they lost, is to ask questions about that relationship and what that relationship was like, who that person was. Because again, there are often these moments of connection that we miss if we just make assumptions of what it means that person lost a parent, a partner, a sibling, whatever, a child, whatever it is. And so just to ask those questions, I think so much of the work that we used to do where we worked with families and we met with them at the hospital, and there were so many people that were there. And I think we had this unique, amazing perspective to get to see everyone who touches people's lives and how often it doesn't fit the traditional assumptions of what who is close and who's the closest, and biological relationships versus found family. And we saw all these things and learned all of these complexities. And it has always made me appreciate how much we don't know about a relationship until we ask a lot of questions, and why just telling someone that, oh, this was my cousin. And sometimes that is like the closest relationship, but you've assumed, oh, their cousin died. Like, because your cousins, you're not so close to your cousins. You've assumed that must be a more distant relationship, or, whatever it is. And so I would for anybody in that space, I think it's one of the things that I've most learned over the years is to appreciate that we don't know anything about the nature of relationships until we actually have conversations about them and talk about them. And that's often where the connection comes. That's often where we learn just how much we might share that we didn't assume we would share.
Yeah. And if it's somebody who wants to open up and talk, that can be a very helpful experience to them as well, to be able to talk about their loved one and share about their loved one. So it helps you and it helps them as well. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, that's all we have for today. We encourage people to reach out and share their thoughts on this. We are on mostly Instagram and Facebook at What's Your Grief. And you can also reach us via email at what'syourgrief@gmail.com. And we will also include anything we have upcoming in the show notes, including information about our communities and other projects we have.